Welcome. My name is Alex Marr, and I'm the Associate Curator for Native American Art at the St. Louis Art Museum, and I'm so pleased to be with you this morning. I want to start with just a very brief acknowledgement that we are gathering on Native land. St. Louis is the home. Sure, yeah, thank you. St. Louis is the homeland for a lineage of indigenous peoples, including members of the Mississippian civilization, later colonial settlement disrupted subsequent indigenous relations with this land, including the Osage Nation and members of the Illini Confederacy. And of course, today, St. Louis is home to a diversity of indigenous peoples. So we are here, we're gathering here this morning for the 13th annual Donald Danforth Jr. Lecture in Native American Art. In 2010, the Donald Danforth Jr. Collection, Carolyn Danforth, and the Danforth Foundation dramatically transformed the presence of Native American art at the St. Louis Art Museum. Through multiple gifts, including 250 works of art, the Danforth family ensured that Native women's art of the Plains contributes to the stories of global artistic achievement that the museum shares with the people of St. Louis and the world. I encourage you to visit the Danforth Gallery on the museum's third floor and see for yourself these remarkable works of art. Please join me in thanking the Danforth family for their support of the museum and its programming. So today I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Philip Deloria, as the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University. A leading scholar in the fields of history and American studies, Dr. Deloria is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's past president of the American Studies Association and a trustee of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. His PhD is in American Studies from the Yale University. Dr. Deloria is a deeply thoughtful, widely cited, and prolific writer who has edited and contributed chapters to multiple publications. His single-author books include Playing Indian, Indians in Unexpected Places, and most recently, Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract. I have a copy here, and the museum shop is selling this book. I want to note that Dr. Deloria will be available immediately following the lecture to sign copies. So Dr. Deloria's scholarship on Sully brings to light this remarkable artist, expanding the canon of Native modern art. Sully's drawings have recently contributed to multiple exhibitions across the country, including Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts in 2019, and our own Action Abstraction Redefined, Modern Native Art from the 1940s to the 1970s, which was on view last summer, that's the summer of 2023. Currently, the Met Museum is presenting Sully's first solo exhibition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deloria to the Slam stage.
Well, it's a beautiful day in St. Louis, isn't it? And that makes me even more grateful that you're here inside with me. So thank you so much for being here. Alex, thank you for the introduction to the museum. Thank you so much for having me. I'm deeply honored to be able to be here and give the Danforth lecture. I was, in 1988, a Dorothy Danforth Compton Fellow as I started my graduate education. So I have a certain kind of gratitude and affection for the Danforth family and the philanthropy that they've enacted in this city and elsewhere over many, many years. So I also want to thank Jessica Kennedy, who has helped me sort of move around a lot. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you today about the work of Mary Sully. She was my great aunt. She was an aspirational but unrecognized artist who, when she died in 1963, would never have imagined that her work was being discussed in major American museums, or hanging on the wall in a single artist show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and being lauded by Holland Cotter of the New York Times. So I'm in a bit of a kind of a tizzy, at the moment. She's having a moment, and it's one that I'm just very, very pleased and honored to be able to lean into. That moment, as Alex mentioned, includes this museum, which included Mary Sully's work, Edwin C. Hill, in its Action Abstraction show just over a year ago. I was fortunate to be passing through St. Louis, and I saw it, I think, maybe 2 days before the show ended. But it's also the case that the St. Louis Art Museum was, in a way, in on these things from the very beginning. When I first realized what I took to be the genius of Mary Sully's work, I approached my curator friends who reminded me that they get many calls coming out of the blue from people who have discovered the artwork of a relative sitting in the basement, and they think that it belongs on the wall of a major museum. They challenged me to prove the importance of this art, which I tried to do in this book, Becoming Mary Sully. I gave a series of experimental talks, refining my argument over time, and listening for other interpretive voices. It is very much a collaborative kind of project here. Sometime between 2011 and 2014, and I can't quite figure out exactly when it was, I gave one of these talks at St. Louis University, and I managed to win over my first curator, Jill Alberg-Yo, who started her career here at SLAM, first as a Mellon Fellow, then as an assistant curator of Native American art, before moving on to Minneapolis, where she was one of the leaders of a kind of co-curatorial team of Native women for this groundbreaking show, Hearts of Our People, Native American Women Artists. So I feel quite a strong connection to this museum, and the support is given while I've been on this journey with my great aunt. I should also say that during COVID, one of the things I was invited to do was a lecture to docents on Zoom. And that was actually my first encounter with the Danforth collection. I was interested in thinking like what's on display, what's in the collection, how can we imagine thinking about these things? And you know, Alex and I were just talking. I just think it's really important as we see this art, we look at the dates, 1890, 1895, 1900, 1905. These are some of the lowest moments for Native American people on this continent, right? There's only about 250,000 Native people here, according to the census of 1900. Intense poverty, trauma, all kinds of awful things. And what's really interesting is this is the moment, right? The moment of one of the greatest and most challenging times is the moment when people invested in producing beautiful art. What's that about, right? The acquisition of the beads that are necessary to make one of these beautiful cradle boards, right? To do these things, there is something really important going on here about this moment. And so as we look at some of these items from the Danforth collection that I'm going to show here in a minute, it's really important not to see these as sort of artifacts of the 19th century, of old things. These are things of a moment that is our moment as well, moments when in the greatest challenge, we invest in producing beautiful things. So I'd like to begin with a little bit of background. The major form of expression of my great aunt was what she called the personality prints. There are 134 of these. They were created between the late 1920s, maybe 1928-ish or so. It's hard to know when she stopped making them. Each of them is a triptych, a 3-part work. She used colored pencil on paper. It's sort of a mid-grade art paper, so it's not just random paper. She had a vision of herself as an artist. And each one of these represented the personality of a person. She was very interested in the question of celebrity. She also did sort of abstract ideas, things like spring or greed, or as I'll show you in a minute, children of divorce. Every now and then, I'm going to shift the presentation of the works here to something like this, so the top panel, middle panel, bottom panel, simply in order to get more of the work on the screen. So the personality prints were the bulk of her work, but thinking about that work in the light of the Danforth collection, as I've done preparing for this talk, also pointed me back to 2 other genres in which she worked. The first was a series of ethnographic illustrations, as you can see here in the center, that she created for her sister, Ella Deloria, an anthropologist. She seems to have started these in the 1930s and continued that work into the 40s and perhaps even into the 1950s. And then second, a series of dramatic illustrations also created for her sister, who hoped to publish a book of Dakota legends. So my plan here for today, a little outline, is to break down the qualities of each panel or position in the triptych, to make some comparisons and connections to Plain's aesthetic traditions using works from the Danforth collection. And I feel quite lucky to have had a chance to go through the 3rd floor gallery just now and be in the presence of these works. And then third, to contextualize multiple artistic influences. Part of my argument here is about how complicated Indian people could be in this period as artistic subjects, as producers and consumers. So Susan Deloria, this was her born name, Susan Deloria, aka Mary Sully, was born in Wakapala, South Dakota, on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. Her father, my namesake, Philip J. Deloria, was the Episcopal minister in charge of the reservation's mission. He was headquartered here at St. Elizabeth's Mission. This particular church burned down, as did the churches at St. Elizabeth's on a couple of different kinds of occasions. And St. Elizabeth's was a really interesting place. There was a missionary teacher there named Mary Sharp Francis, who was quite rigorous, taught the students Latin and all kinds of interesting things. It was a surprisingly rigorous and often tolerant mission school, which Susie attended. So when we hear some of the stories of traumatic boarding schools, there's some trauma at this school, but there was also a school that was bilingual in many cases. And certainly the sermons that my great-grandfather gave were in the Dakota language. The hymnal they used was a Dakota language hymnal. The Bible they read out of was a Dakota language Bible. So it was a quite vital kind of space. After graduating from St. Elizabeth, she then went on, as had her sister, to the All Saints School in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This is a kind of boarding school, but not a Native American boarding school. It was a school for colonial elites to send their children off to Sioux Falls and get a very good education. But Susie Deloria did not thrive there. She spent most of her time afterwards at home, taking care of her father. By the 1920s, though, she had joined her sister Ella in Lawrence, Kansas, where Ella taught girls health and physical education at the Haskell Indian School. Ella had also started writing pageants. This was a really prominent form back at that moment. And Susie, who was in the process of shifting her name from Susan Deloria to Mary S. Deloria, as you can see here, costumes designed by, worked alongside her as she did on a number of these pageants. She attended courses sporadically at the University of Kansas and, among other things, conceived of a possible future for herself as an art teacher and maybe even as an artist and designer. The only semester where I can actually find a transcript for her, she took an art history class, she took a drawing class, and she took French, actually. Sometime in the late 1920s, she seems to have fixed on this pattern of 3 linked images. And these first ones here that are on kind of bracketing the slide are recognizable, and recognizable, I think, as being early in her kind of creative process in 2 ways. First, with these first 8, she identified the subjects only using their last name. And as you can see, she uses a very limited color palette and a great deal of empty or negative kind of space. All of this would change as she developed the style. There would be more color, more depth, more texture spread more fully across the paper. Indeed, in some of the later works, as I look at them, she's sitting there with a box of colored pencils, basically, and and you could tell she was getting very interested in depth and texture, and she wanted a richer color, and she was working the pencils really hard and sort of shifting and changing, trying to gather, some greater depth. And she did start to experiment using white paint. She was oftentimes interested in things that were white ice, for example, that led her into using paint, and occasionally gilt. So she had some different kinds of media besides colored pencils, but these were her main way of thinking about things. Interestingly, with this work, when you know who the person is, the work takes on more meaning. So how many people have an idea about who Steinmetz might be? Never mind, I know you don't. And I didn't either. When my mom and I first pulled these works out in the mid-1970s, you couldn't just Google someone. But when we pulled them out later in 2006, I sat there with my laptop and I tried to figure out who people were. And it turns out Steinmetz was a really interesting character, an electrical engineer who invented this thing that transitions AC current and DC current back and forth. And knowing that, suddenly, you look at this kind of circular disc at a kind of a sine wave, and you've got these arrows, and you're like, I think she's talking about that, right? I think that's what this is about. There may be someone out here who knows the history of Greta Garbo super well and can tell me what might be meant by the top panel over there, because I haven't actually figured that one out yet. So these top panels tend to sort of toe the line between abstraction, symbolism, and representation. And sometimes they are legible, and at other times they are very, very challenging. So Nyla Cram Cook, who was a really interesting person who had gone to India and studied with Gandhi and got thrown out and was sort of a poet. It's not quite clear what this is. Is it a path that's leading to enlightenment? Is it a sail? There was a series of media stories about her return from India and falling in love with a sailor on a ship. And I don't know, right? I don't know. On the other hand, Alison Skipworth, she's doing a visual pun, right, to show a rock skipping across a pond, and what's waiting at the other side? Stardom. Alison Skipworth was a movie actor. Or Helen Wills, who was an American tennis player. And if you look closely at these things, you can see sort of tennis icons that are happening here. So the first of these influences then that I would like to sort of put in your mind is that she had a really deep interest in American popular culture. She cared about movies, she cared about films, she cared about shows. And because she was able to spend some part of her life in New York, she was able to actually sort of imagine these things. But she and her sister were also regular subscribers to the Saturday Evening Post, to Time Magazine, right, which in those days did a lot of coverage about sort of the high arts and the fine arts in ways that they don't necessarily do today. This particular image I absolutely love because I think when you look at her image for Florenz Ziegfeld, you can see exactly this kind of like balancing of human figures and women and matching their hair in different ways to kind of create a sort of circular kind of pattern. But you can also see the influence of, for example, the comics. Right? These little bald heads of an audience of men, right, seem to come straight out of the comic pages of the 1930s. And then what you can see is that she's taken the star elements here and she's taken the bald heads and created them into this kind of visual design element then before distilling them down further in this third panel. So here's another case, as I mentioned before, Children of Divorce. She's representing visually, quite literally, the contents of a magazine article in Good Housekeeping called Children of Divorce that speaks at length about the struggles of two-ness and how as a child the writer was trying to blossom in two different environments and sort of grow and bloom in one place, but then getting shuttled off to a different parent and trying to grow in another kind of place. And here I'd like to start introducing some visual comparisons that are drawn from some of the works in the Danforth collection. In particular, when one goes to the online finding aid for this particular piece of work, which we're fortunate to see upstairs just a minute ago, what we get is this sort of really interesting kind of treatment about the nature of this beadwork, that it features mirrored designs, the doubling that acknowledges relations between the earth's surface and the spiritual realm, while Lakota people recognize common meanings for certain symbols, yes, abstract designs, communicate stories and ideas also indirectly. Beadwork thus accrues meaning through composition as much as established interpretation. And I think that's just really an important thing. It's not necessarily, right, that there are symbols and icons that get translated from traditional beadwork into some of the works of Mary Sully, but there are compositional elements and styles that make their way here in the case of this kind of doubling, both a kind of vertical doubling across a kind of earth line and a kind of, or a horizontal doubling and a kind of vertical doubling, as well. Oops. So here's an earlier work, George Bernard Shaw. It marks one of her first forays away from pencil, as I mentioned, and towards the use of white paint. But again, it also suggests some of the formal affinities based around compositional technique. The diamonds and triangles, which are so characteristic of beadwork, but also of parfleche painting. The rows and squares, also oftentimes very much visible in beadwork kinds of traditions. And simply to offer one additional example, and to remind us of the ways in which these top panels are often funny and playful and punning, and really winning, I think. I can't help but look at this and smile. Here, Kansas Jayhawks, literally birds, little Kansas Jayhawk birds lift the winged Mercury feet of the track star Glenn Cunningham. And I think it's also worth pausing for a moment on the beauty of this middle panel, which is just this lovely, gorgeous kind of design. So, but I then want to note again, her interest in mirroring and dualisms and two-ness, whether it's up and down, raw or cooked, earth and sky, left foot and right foot. These things show up a lot in her work. So the middle panels then are, I think, quite explicitly aiming for design patterns, wallpapers, textiles, linoleums, tiles, things like this. These are often grids. They're arranged on grids, but sometimes they push the boundaries of visible grid patterns of repetition. For example, in this one on the far right, Highway Rudeness, where there's definitely a grid there, but there's also a kind of sort of spatial illusion, right? Sort of like you're also looking at a kind of depth situation there. And she liked to do those kinds of things. This was a moment of opportunity for vernacular women and designers to enter contests. And it was a moment of explosive creativity when it came to these kinds of patterns. The Staley Silk Company would recruit celebrities to do design patterns. Women's Wear would open up competitions for women to submit design kinds of things. And you happen to be at the Met, I do advise you to go and take in the Mary Sully show, but it's also worth making your way over to the Modern and Contemporary Gallery, where they actually have some of the Staley Silk patterns on display. I've swapped out a couple of ones that are in the public domain for ones that are not, but the ones that are not are the ones that are on the wall at the Met, and the comparison is really quite telling. I think one of the most amazing middle panels is this one. It reflects a moment when I think Mary Sully started to move away from these middle panel designs as simply kind of industrial possibilities, right? And began taking them very, very seriously as artistic works, right? They became so interesting that they might well defy any effort to make them into a textile or a wallpaper or linoleum, right? I mean, this is a beautiful design. It's not clear that you would want it on your wall necessarily. It's also the case that this work in particular really challenged me for a long time. Lawrence Tibbett was an opera singer who did a kind of crossover. He was actually also a really prominent member of one of the early musicians' unions. And for a long time, I looked at this and all I could see was a kind of human trilobite, kind of two eyes and two arms kind of sticking in a sort of body sticking out here. And I just couldn't make sense of it. But at one point, I was reading more about Lawrence Tibbett, and thus my argument that the more you know, the more you see. And I learned that he had a little cabin in a place called Temescal Canyon in Los Angeles, and that Temescal Canyon had a little amphitheater. And he would go and stand on the amphitheater in the canyon and sing. And the notes would echo and bounce out of the canyon. And suddenly I realized what I was seeing as a trilobite was actually a negative kind of inversion, kind of optical illusion, that's empty space. That's the empty space of a canyon with notes echoing out of it. And suddenly I realized, of course, these are sedimentary rocks, and that's the Pacific Ocean, and these are hills. And suddenly it became a landscape, right, with all of these things. And then I looked more closely at this, and I looked at these little Easter eggs, which are notes, and I realized that she had inverted the thing and turned it upside down, right? Here's the ocean, here's the sedimentary rocks, here's the notes. So it's as if she's looking at this through a camera obscura, right, which flips the image and sort of, so there's something really interesting going on inside her head, right, about these kinds of things. And they just produce these incredible works of great beauty. I think it's also worth pausing then to point to a different kind of plains aesthetic influence, that of the rotational symmetry found in circles, both quilled and beaded medallions, really common kinds of things on the plains. Sully used this kind of rotational symmetry in each of the three panels, but it often appears in kaleidoscopic designs in both the bottoms and the middles. And I've just given you an example here, a top panel, Amelia Earhart, and a fantastic middle panel. This was Dr. Defoe, who delivered the Dion quintuplets, and the entire thing is themed in collections of 5. A second influence was this anthropological sensibility, also nurtured in New York City. So Ella Deloria worked with Franz Boas, who was sort of one of the foundational figures of American anthropology. She worked with Ruth Benedict, who was kind of her sort of administrative handler. She worked later in her life with Margaret Mead. So these are sort of like some of the canonical figures of American anthropology at mid-century. And Benedict, in particular, who really kind of helped theorize something called culture and personality anthropology with this book, Patterns of Culture, in 1934. And both Benedict and Mead then produced these really interesting books, which are studies of culture and personality. And what I realize as I'm thinking about this is, of course, Ella is moving in this circle with Boas and Benedict and Mead, thinking about culture and personality and the relations between them. And Mary Sully is thinking about the relations between cultures and personalities, right, in terms of celebrity. So they're in the same kind of intellectual world. What's interesting to me is they were probably developing on somewhat separate paths at about the same time. If Mary Sully was thinking in the late 20s, and if Ruth Benedict is publishing in sort of the early 30s, the conversations I imagine among them, right, are of two people kind of converging on similar sorts of ideas. So just a few other examples here. I think this is a great one. It's one of my favorites, John Philip Sousa. And you can see that the elements of the personality of the person who is shaping culture and being shaped by culture. Here, the sousaphone, which he invents, and which becomes the sort of the giant bell for the marching tuba, the very notion of marching bands on a field, football itself, musical notes, and the colors of the University of Illinois, right? So this work is densely packed with the markers that define a person. Or in this one, Malcolm Campbell, who was a speed driver. He raced in a super cool looking car called the Bluebird. And I couldn't make sense of this either. Like, there's a bird on wheels. I don't know what that's about. But it turns out, of course, it's a very direct kind of reference to the Bluebird on these racing tracks. He wore these very distinctive driving goggles. And what she oftentimes did was use color to signify things which were intangible, like speed in this particular case. Or Fred Astaire, where we can see feet moving fast and kind of spotlightish things looking at those feet. So this rotational symmetry, I think, follows other kinds of planes aesthetics in the ways that rotational center of the paper or center of the hide might imply circularity, and does, but in fact also takes the forms of squares and rectangles. So circles and grids in certain kinds of forms of combination, as you can see here with this beautiful kind of pipe bag. So this context with Ella put her in the realm of thinking ethnographically. And I indeed think that Mary Sully was a sort of native ethnographer of America and American popular culture in the 1930s, but also led her to do some more concrete kinds of illustration where you can see her engagement with the material culture, right, of Native people, especially Native women of the Northern Plains. And I would just point to this book, which was Ella's ethnography, which only came out last year. All of my relatives, okay, not all my relatives. My dad has published over 30 books in the course of his life, but these relatives, Ella in particular, struggled to get her work into print, and it took a long time. And actually, none of the Mary Sully illustrations ended up in this book, but if you're interested in learning about Dakota kinship, this is a great and amazing kind of book. So she had this very rich kind of consciousness, I think, of the materiality of Dakota life, and you can see in this illustration a kind of a teepee or lodge that's just full, bursting with parfleshes and purses and pipe bags and all kinds of interesting things that are going on. So here's just a few examples of some of this ethnographic illustration that she was doing. Here we can see this war club, and I just wanted to sort of highlight the ways in which what she was drawing is very, very much like the war club that we can see in the Danforth collection. Or here we've got this beautiful little cradle board, this pipe. And here we can see also these amazing cradle boards, these beautiful pipe bags. We're not putting pipes on display anymore, not really good museum practice, but the pipe bag itself. Or here we can see this sort of the doll, the Indian girl who's sort of working with the doll, and suddenly we see the toy cradle, the dolls that are upstairs. One of the things that really struck me walking through the gallery today is how much dolls, miniatures, models, small things, right? Small and intricate and beautiful things are part of that collection. I think that also is maybe a reflection of those years, those hard years of the 1890s. Maybe you can't make a full-on cradle board, but maybe you can make a lot of small, interesting things, right? That carry on meanings and traditions and are, in fact, beautiful. Sometimes these ethnographic illustrations made their way directly into the personality prints, in this case, Shirley Temple with this kind of robe or cape. And this one, Jane Withers, who was a sort of kind of a Shirley Temple sidekick known for her braids. And suddenly the braids and this hair tie end up being a really critical part of the image. Also another great example as we're looking at sort of the hair ornaments in this fabulously beautiful one that you can find in the Danforth collection as well. This one also, Billie Burke had a really interesting early career, but we know her best as the character of Glinda the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz. And knowing that, and you think back to the movie, right? And Glinda is floating in on one of these kind of pulsating bubbles and ending up in this kind of the floral land of Munchkin Land. And so it's completely consistent, right? We'd have these bubbles, but then we would have a floral design. And now she's given us an ethnographic kind of label, to go with that. And of course, some of the things that we can see again across this range of material object are these floral designs that really do come out of the plains tradition or the woodlands tradition of more Dakota than Lakota people further east than some of the Western folks. So there's also another element here that is worth sort of talking about. Why did she call herself Mary Sully, right? Why would she choose that particular name? Well, it turns out that there's a genealogical sort of question here. She was actually related to Thomas Sully, who was a very, very prominent portrait painter of the antebellum period. He painted all of these very, very well-known kinds of folks. He was basically painting the first generation of celebrities, and she was painting the first generation of mass media celebrities. And so there's a kind of affinity between their projects. And Susie, or Ella and Mary, the names start to get confusing, had a lot of these conversations about, like, is there a racial inheritance of something like artistic talent that might go across generations? So they were very interested in sort of both claiming the name Sully for its traction in the world of American art, but also claiming the possibility that there was some kind of artistic skill or talent that came to them genealogically through this character, Thomas Sully. And here you can see the way that the family is kind of laid out. Thomas Sully, and his son Alfred Sully, who was a military officer, really responsible for the ethnic cleansing of the Northern Plains in the years after 1862, after the Minnesota-Dakota uprising, but also an artist in his own right. He was sending art back to his father in Philadelphia. So there's a kind of an artistic tradition there then that goes from this woman, Pehantutuen, and Alfred Sully, down through Mary Sully's mother, and so she took her name there. She was also called Akichitawin, soldier woman, after her father, which then leads to this generation, and then leads to my generation. But on the other side, this character, Sasue, Chechehina also known as Francois Deslauriers, and there's my great-grandfather, Philip J. Deslauriers. And so you can see the way that the family works, and that there's this claim to artistic kind of forces in the past that passed genealogically through. And it wasn't just confined to this question of, like, did Thomas Sully's art genes make their way down to Mary Sully? It also takes the form around Pehantutuen, her great-grandmother. There's this one letter where the personality prints actually have a name. They're called the Luta personality prints. And this is this really interesting moment when we think about sort of what Luta actually carries in Dakota and Lakota language, right? This sense of red and scarlet, a particular kind of red. There's a regular kind of everyday red, Sha, right? But this is Luta. It's a different kind of red. It's the red that you put in a name. It's the red that you attach to honoring. It's a kind of more sacred sort of red. It's an important sort of red. So to call them the Luta personality prints is actually to say something about the nature of these things. It's also associated with art and the production of art, of red quill work, these kinds of things. So, for example, for me, then that connection takes really tangible shape in a work like this, George Ade, where she puts a little notation on it that he was very generous in sharing the grounds of his estate with other people. She means to honor him, and she's honoring him by really creating this work, the personality print, and by capping it off with these beautiful red moccasins. And of course, one of the fabulous sort of elements that we can see upstairs in the Danforth collection is how much Donald Danforth Jr. Seems to have loved moccasins. They're fabulous moccasins up here. So I just wanted to gesture to that one and to show you another one, Bobby Jones. If there's any golfers out here, my reading of this is that this is actually a kind of a rangefinder. This is both a golf club head, a blade, but this is also, here's your pitching wedge, here's your mashie, here's your fairway iron, right, these different kinds of range things. But she's converted this golf gesture to Bobby Jones into moccasins. And in this case, beaded or quilled moccasins with a richer color palette than just the simple red moccasins, right? So I'm getting carried away here and I'm losing my place. Oh, I'm back. So in that light, the place of her grandmother, whose name translates into Red Crane Woman, was, I think, of equal or greater importance than that of Thomas Sully. We know Thomas Sully from the Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. We don't really know some of these Plains women, but it fits within a tradition of what Janet Berlow, a long-time fabulous art historian, called the tradition of the double woman in Native American arts. And this is an illustration of a double woman ceremony that Ella had sort of either collected or had someone draw for her. It's a really complicated sort of position, this position of the double woman. It's the woman who's sort of isolated, who sits on the edge of the camp circle. She might be promiscuous, right? She might not fit, but she might also be a great artist, or she might have the gift and the talent of art. And in this case, the art doesn't come to you through practice and learning and skill, and it doesn't come to you through the genetic inheritance of your great-grandfather. It comes to you as a spiritual thing, right? A vision that you have in which you suddenly have this incredible capacity for brilliant art production. And one of the things about her grandmother was that there was talk that she may have been a double woman, right? She may have had this kind of artistic sort of thing. And so it really represents this Dakota epistemological sort of approach to art making. These women were themselves sort of double women, right? So Mary Sully or Susie Deloria, she's doubling her name, she's doubling her identity. She's constantly traveling with her sister. They are sort of doubles of one another. They're exchanging things. They are two, I think, native geniuses moving through the world together. They're isolated a little bit. They're on the fringes of their own society. You can't be, as Ella was, a Dakota ethnographer of your own people without being on a marginal kind of space, right? So they embody, in some ways, this kind of thing. So yet another way to think about this is to put them back into New York City and to think a bit about modernism and the possibilities in their New York life. What's stunning to me is there's so many radio celebrities and movie stars and writers and playwrights and these high culture figures, and there's only one artist, right? So all the famous artists do not show up here. So she's not drawing other artists except for this one case, a woman named Annie Stein, who is actually quite hard for me to track down, who seems to have been a kind of, she went to the Art Students League and she took some courses. She had an exhibit at one of the YMCA, in a public library. She was in some ways a kind of a New York socialite art version of Mary Sully herself, right? Always kind of on the margins of the art world, a kind of talent in that space between the talented amateur and the very, very low level professional, right? I think this may have been a bid for patronage, perhaps, but that's a conjecture only. But we can imagine the sort of world of art in which these sisters were able to move in New York City. And I've been particularly struck by the sort of resonance between her and Charles Demuth, who engaged in this kind of project that he called poster portraits, which were personality portraits of his friends in this sort of circle. The most famous of these, which you maybe know or probably know, is I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold, a portrait of William Carlos Williams. And you can see the same kind of interest in sort of time, skewing and things space getting a little bit messy and out of place. Here's another one of a sketch for a poster portrait that he did of Marsden Hartley. You can see this is 1929. Where some of these things are actually on display. These were part of the worlds of Ella and Susie moving back and forth in and out of New York. And here is Gertrude Stein. They both ended up doing a portrait of the same person. So you can see Charles Demuth on the left and Mary Sully doing on the right. A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, these kinds of things. She also did Eugene O'Neill. Both of them did the same person there. So worth thinking a little bit about those things. Which then leads me to think a bit about sort of cosmopolitanism here and how it plays out. There's a really complex visual and aesthetic vocabulary here with a kind of a Dakota twist, right? So what's happening is a continuity to the past, an echoing of these early 19th century styles, right? Long horizontal rows, medallions, these kinds of things, but also adapting for this particular kind of moment. And that would lead us then to think about the modern panels. Right, and I've sort of imagined a movement through the triptychs from these complex modernist images in the top to these modern design panels in the middle to something kind of beyond modernism in the bottom, a hybrid set of forms that point to a Native American future, both Indian and constantly engaged with the world. And in making that argument, I've taken this work, Indian History, as kind of the master key to the series of the work. The top panel, I think, has references to the works of Diego Rivera, the kind of mural form, to Aaron Douglas, these kind of modern silhouetted figures of anxiety, perhaps Jacob Lawrence. And I think there's a useful point of reference here, which is to the bottom of these strips in this first panel of an idyllic native life, right? Pre-contact and pre-conquest. And it points us to some of the ways that she was explicitly bringing Native themes into her work. So here, the Parfleche tradition, in this work by about Cornelia Otis Skinner, and here you can see, right, some Parfleche upstairs. There's several beautiful ones. And the same kind of color palette, right? This is really characteristic, particularly of Dakota Parfleche. And that same color palette makes its way into the center strip here of the bottom panel. Babe Ruth, we can see this kind of slit pattern, this kind of optical illusion sort of pattern. You can see this in a number of other kind of objects. Alice Fazende, the last Confederate widow, this sort of triangular shape where we can see, for example, in this knife sheath case, same kind of structures. In this one, Lenton Fontaine, where she's making an explicit reference to their lavender marriage and their sort of paths to stardom. But at the bottom, these Parfleche boxes, which also showed up as her ethnographic illustration, and which show up again here in the large collection of beautiful possible bags, in this case in pairs, right, that we can also see upstairs in the Danforth collection as well. These sort of young girls with toys and models, and again, this sort of, interest in the small, right, in the model and the toy. She began moving away from abstract geometric designs, women's work, which is to say, right, women's art of the plains used geometries as a form of abstraction, whereas men were doing more pictographic kinds of things. And there's a really interesting kind of moment, here's some pictographic sorts of works, at Standing Rock in the early 20th century, where women start to adopt, in a beadwork idiom, start to adopt the pictographic styles of men. And we can see this, I think, in some of her work. So Mary Sully was always Native, though only a few times in terms of her actual subject material. There's really only 3 of these where she's explicitly using American Indian themes. And this is one of them, the Native Church, where she's framed the entire practice of Native Christianity as one dependent upon Native women, all of whom are depicted here in traditional clothing, designs, patterns, and which in the end returns to a quillwork pattern, a kind of folded quill pattern. This is the highest art, right, considered for many Northern Plains women. A second one of these is Bishop Hare, Zikaladuzahan, right, traveling bird, and you can see she's got this incredible visual pun in the top image where she's got the figure of a cross, which is split at the bottom to create the legs of a man, and which is clipped on the arms to create the wings of a bird. And she's really doing a sort of 3-part kind of message here. So, which would take us then back to this last one, that she has an Indian theme on, Native history, a view of history that connects Plains traditions to contemporary kinds of challenges. So in the top panel, we can see this kind of like oppressive, awful kind of toxic smoke and these feet which are literally pressing down on the aspirations of these modernist Indian people who are trying to rise, leaving some behind. This reservation kind of thing drawn in graphite, right, as this sort of kind of a realm of despair. And then this sort of beautiful idyllic thing. These 4 sort of bands get converted then. The color of the kind of Indian camp turns into an abstract design, the barbed wire fence, the modernist anxieties, and the feet, which are crunching us. And then in the bottom panel, she flips the whole thing on its side and makes it very abstract. So these are the feet. You can see a blue jeans and boots there. These are the modernist figures of anxiety. Here's the barbed wire of history. And triumphing over that, right, overwriting the barbed wire of history is the colors of the Parfleche, the diamonds, and the triangular kinds of designs that are happening here. And if we were to sort of go back to this first image and look at this bottom panel, I think I meant to talk through that in using those large frames. But if we look at this bottom panel, we can see that it too is drenched with all kinds of things, material culture, headdresses, this sort of rawhide tanning, cradle boards, medallions, parfleches, right? She was drawing on the material objects, the material culture that were so important. And once you see these native elements, I think, they start to appear everywhere. So to take us back to the very first image of Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was a sort of radio preacher, and here's a radio horn and people listening, or perhaps ideas coming out. Once you start thinking about these things, you start seeing them everywhere. So just to go to the bottom panel as a way of summarizing, we can see this sort of doubling We can see these box and line patterns. We can see these diamond and triangle patterns. We can see the rotational symmetry. All of these things are found in a single panel, right? So this is part of this sort of aesthetic. And at the same time, right, we can also see the sort of Egyptian flavor and the spotlights of Amelia Earhart. We can see the synesthetic connections between art and music, particularly here with the sort of color of the fingers plucking on his harp, and the kind of flat out Art Deco design, right, that we can see here. Or the sort of nature of Hollywood celebrities and her aspirations for commercial design sorts of patterns. It all adds up to a complex art knitting together city and reservation, Northern Plains aesthetic strategies and American modernism, adaptation and change over time with persistence and survivance. And I want to thank you for letting me share some of it with you today. So. And I think at this point, if folks have questions, we have a few minutes for this, and there's microphones roaming around, and I'd be happy to try to address anything that anyone is curious about.
And if you want to just raise your hand, we'll come to you with a microphone.
There's one.
There's one down here. I'll bring the mic. We ask you to speak into the mic so that everybody can hear the question and the response.
I'm going to formulate this as it comes out of my mouth, so appreciate your patience. I'm interested in, especially some of the last work you talked about, kind of the moments of resistance that come up in this work, and I'm interested if you could, or maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how this ties to or is contextualized by kind of the white settler fetishization of native visual culture, both in the past and in the present, and maybe also has some kind of ties to or can help to inform or help us understand kind of contemporary moments of indigenous resistance, especially, in response to the white settler kind of gaze.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you kind of think back, one of the images I showed was the two sisters sort of side by side wearing their princess gear, right? And, they were really aware of those sort of like the nature of white fetishization, right? Of Indian women, of Indian people, of Indian objects, right? And they were of a generation, I think, that found it useful and important to sort of slide into those things just far enough to raise questions and perhaps pull people out of them, right? So they're engaged in this very delicate kind of cultural dance that is about persuasion and seduction as much as it is about sort of forthright statements. The sort of anti-colonial moment that we can imagine for ourselves today is not the moment that they had. Right, they were limited and constrained, I think, in what they were able to do, particularly if they wanted to survive in the sort of wage labor economies that they were in. So one of the things that Ella does often, it's actually how Ella introduced my grandfather and my grandmother together, is she used to be an expert for Campfire Girls. And she would do this Campfire Girl thing. And she would buy manufactured Indian stuff from a guy in Maine, and then she would take it and she would mark it up and sell it. Right? Now, we can sort of think about this in terms of politics of authenticity, or we can think about it in terms of politics of survivance. We can think about it in terms of politics of resistance. We don't know quite what's in her head if she's saying like, "You suckers, I can't believe I got you," or if she's saying like, "Oh man, life is hard and I got to get by," right? I mean, it's probably some combination of those, of those things. For the most part, I think that this art is operating in that space, right? In the space of like saying like, this is native stuff, and I'm not actually going to beat you over the head with it because I can't, And that's why I think this Indian history image is one of the moments where she's really kind of explicitly political. But for the most part, she's not. The fact that she doesn't really deal with other native kinds of themes, and yet that the art is absolutely permeated with native presence, right? It's everywhere. So she's constructed this thing, which is, I think, a resistance document, right? Is a survivance kind of document, but is constrained within the politics of that particular moment, And I think one of the things that's really important about that native history, series is the ways that like, it's not that she's in the middle panel in particular. It's not that she's saying like, I have abandoned sort of my desires to create wallpaper and instead will create art. She's saying like, I'm not doing wallpaper and I'm not doing art. I'm doing a political kind of statement, right? I mean, that middle panel is kind of outrageous, right? And the ways that she takes the native color and escalates it and elevates it. So the reds become purples and pinks, which have within a sort of Lakota color palette have a kind of vibrational similarity. She's doing native stuff as she's kind of elevating those, those kinds of things. So I've been very, very curious about like when, this is obviously a late work. Is it her last work? Who knows, right? Who knows? But it does seem like there's a kind of a coming to consciousness and a change in the kind of political system or situation that you can imagine in ways that the 50s are different from, or the late 40s are different from the late 20s. And in fact, I'll say one more thing about this, and I promise not to ramble on. One of the things my grandfather said in his later part of his life was like, I've done this whole thing. I've been a missionary. I've been in the church. And now, I'm sick of this all, and I just want to be an Indian person. Right? And there's that kind of moment in later life when I think people find themselves liberated in certain kinds of ways. And I wonder if that's not part of it, but I also wonder if the sort of, the need for an oppositional politics, particularly as we head into the 50s and sort of the fights against termination and these kinds of things, are not also part of it. So it's hard to say exactly, but what I'd like people to think about when we think about this is a resource for thinking about Native politics at a really challenging and complicated time. It's a resource for thinking about Native women as being the innovators, right, of an American Indian modernism, which is often framed around the Guy culture of the Institute of American Indian Arts in the 1960s. And, I actually end the book by saying, like, please imagine this world of Native women who are producing things for the market, for themselves, for their families, right, beautiful objects. Like, this is actually the locus of American Indian art in this period. So I think these are all things that then carry with them a kind of political potential for the now. I mean, that would be my hope. Rather than to see these as kind of a quaint artifact of the 30s, to see them as actual things that, though no one saw them until a few years ago, that they've actually changed the way that we can think about the past and the present. I didn't mean to get on a soapbox there, but this is thank you for the question, because it's a really hard one, I think.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing the magnificent art. And I was not aware of this. It's fascinating. I do want to underscore one thing that you mentioned, her not doing so much to the Native people, because Will Rogers dies in 1935. He is the highest paid film star for a number of years, besides being on the radio, besides being in the newspaper, and in essence, maybe not an athlete, like a runner or a tennis player, but certainly physicality with his roping, which got him started. And yet she's not in this. Now, I understand why, but I mean, that would have been a prime one if you were going to include that.
I'm so glad you asked about that, because she did do one for Will Rogers. And what's really interesting is it completely focuses on roping, and it focuses on his early, I think it may have happened before he died, actually. It focuses on roping, and it focuses on his early career when he was sort of bouncing around to doing global stuff, right? Will Rogers was everywhere, South America, and there's a particular fascination with Egypt. So there's this kind of Egyptian groove to the Will Rogers image that is, so I puzzled over the Will Rogers thing for a long time, and I'm not, and there's 134 of them, and I can't include all of them in, and so I picked ones that are sort of make certain kinds of arguments, but it's a great point, and the Will Rogers image is really interesting, and is one I want to do more with, going forward in the future, because exactly as you say, yeah.
Thanks, that was great. Yeah, so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, you just talk a little bit in the Indian history. Sorry, thank you. How the bottom panel is you think it's a vision, it points to a native future, right? Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because, it pushes the other stuff to the side and it puts the color in the middle. And like, what does that future look like to Mary Sully, and how maybe a lot of these bottom panels maybe point to some kind of future rather than the past?
Yeah, well, so there's two elements to this, right? One is sort of just coming out of this image where I really do think that the sort of, the ways in which that bottom panel of green and women doing things translates into that other thing, which in the middle section, which then translates into the symmetrical kind of center of the bottom panel, where that's the only place where there's like explosive color. It is the place where you've got some, really stuff happening. So I think there's an argument there. I mean, I'm repeating the argument, but I think that center thing really does matter. But in the larger context, I mean, these things can be read. These are art. This is art, right? And people bring different kinds of interpretations to it. And one of the things that was really striking to me was I have a lot of friends in Taiwan, and I've been to Taiwan 6 times, and I've given this talk to a couple different audiences in Taiwan, and they're like, "Why do you read it from top to bottom? Why are you nationalizing that? Maybe you read it from bottom to top." Maybe you read them kind of sideways, maybe you read, right? So they were like actually sort of helping me think that like there's a complex kind of spatiality to this. Because I do think that the experience of seeing the images in front of you gives you 2 different things that are happening. One is like they're all in a single frame, at least this is how they have them at the Met and how they have them here, at SLAM last year. So you're seeing them within a frame, and you're seeing them as as compositional elements within a single work, right? They are together. In the book, I called it like a bag of marbles that are all very similar and kind of part of the same whole. At the same time, right, when we look at a work of art, we know that the eye starts in a certain place and moves to other places, right? Artists, this is part of like the art and the skill of being a great artist is like, where am I going to send people to first? Where's the secondary kind of thing? Where's the tertiary thing, right? How do we do this? So there's a sequential kind of experience of viewing them as well. And I've struggled a lot to think like, do they see the first panel? Do we see the first panel, the top panel first? Do we, is that the way that eye is being trained, here? And my argument in the book is that it is that the top panels tend to have more color. The color is in blocky kinds of forms. There are larger kinds of structures. It is an easier place for the eye to go if they're hung in a certain kind of way, and who knows how she hung them. She only showed them a couple of times in these Indian schools, so presumably smaller people. But now when they're hung, basically the top panel is eye level or slightly above. And I think there's a sort of sense in which like you go to that first panel, you see this and you start internalizing it, and then you are logically led, right, into these other panels. So part of the argument here is that sort of modernist panel that starts things is not an endpoint, but is a beginning point, right? And if there's a linear argument that's being made, we have to think, how do we track from that first panel, which I see as being kind of quintessentially modernist. So that's where we're starting. We're starting in an Indian modernity. And then we're moving into this complicated space, which, it's not crazy, I don't think, to sort of see within that the kind of structural patterns of culture that Ruth Benedict was talking about, right? There's a kind of interesting thing happening, which then forces you to think, like, what does the bottom panel look like? And the fact that the bottom panel is not always native, right? It's super complex, it's super cosmopolitan, they're very rangy across different kinds of things. I think the bottom panels are just a representation of the possibilities for sort of native life with a future, right? With futurity. And if we think about the context of the moment when she's making this art in the 1930s, right? This is the moment in 1934 of the Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act, tribal governments are being formed, there's other kinds of things happening. This is a decolonizing, but also a neo-imperial kind of act. It's a complicated moment. And she's in the middle of all this stuff. She's not active in a tribal governance kind of way. But, my grandfather is, when the Bureau of Indian Affairs folks come to Pine Ridge, he's their first translator, and he is like literally translating the terms of the Indian Reorganization Act to the tribal to the tribal leaders, the pre-tribal council to the tribal leaders, at Pine Ridge, so and the sisters are staying with him, right? They are constantly crashing at my grandfather's house. They are largely unhoused in many cases, right? So they're staying in Indian boarding schools in the summer. They are staying in abandoned Episcopal church rectories. They are crashing with my grandfather. They're moving, or they sleep in their car sometimes, right? So they are very impoverished, right? They're operating at a very basic kind of level. So they are witnessing this moment of kind of political and psychological kind of trauma, but also possibility. And I think the possibility part is, for me, what emerges out of this. And it goes back to this question about how we think of this as a resource for contemporary kind of politics and ways of thinking about it. I think she was seeing possibilities. I think those bottom panels like point us to futurity in a kind of linear way, but also in terms of their content and their style and their form, you know. And I can imagine a more depressing reading of these images, but I like this as an optimistic kind of reading. I think it's an empowering reading for Native folks. And to me, that's really kind of important.
All right, well, thank you. I think that's going to be our last question. So thank you very much. Let's give.
Thank you all.